Good morning and welcome to the fourth episode of Full Throttle here on Unprecedented TV. I'm Paul Naylor, Communications Director for the Alliance of British Drivers, and today we're tackling the soaring costs of fuel and the government's relentless net zero agenda.
And I'm Brian Gregory, Policy Director of the Alliance of British Drivers. Today we're very pleased to be joined by Kathryn Porter, who's a knowledgeable energy expert, and she's going to unpack the dangerous shortcomings of UK energy policy, debunk the myth that renewables are cheap, and reveals how these policies are choking economic growth, and as well as hitting the wallets of road users and effectively everybody else. So from global energy failures to practical solutions, this is a must-watch episode. Buckle up. This is Full Throttle.
So, hello, Kathryn.
Welcome.
Hello.
Hello there. So, Kathryn, tell us what your background is and how did you end up in the energy security sphere?
My degree is in physics. I then went to work in the city, initially looking at technology companies. I was a casualty of the dot-com bust back in 2000. And after taking some time to do an MBA, I went back in the city. I then went into commodities and quite quickly specialized in energy. And I spent maybe a decade or so bouncing between the trading floors of banks and utilities, very much working at the sort of coalface of the financial side of the energy markets. And then just under 10 years ago, I set up my own consulting business. And originally, I started out doing very much commercial consulting, again, at that financial side of the market. But increasingly, I do a lot of work around policy and regulation that's impacting businesses so much. So it's not just in terms of how they negotiate and structure contracts and risk management, which is what I started out doing, but how will policy and regulatory change impact their business? And do they need to get proactive in terms of lobbying government around some of those choices? And so that's an increasingly large part of my work. And then I also have discussions with both Ofgem, the regulator, and various politicians. I'm open to speak to any politician. I get a lot of engagement from the Conservatives, from Reform. I'm actually speaking at the SDP conference this year. I've had various independent MPs reach out to me. Labour and the Lib Dems are not interested in engaging, and this is something that we see actually across the board. It's not just me they don't want to talk to. They don't talk to anybody that doesn't share their somewhat idealist world view.
Brilliant.
I'm not surprised.
Right. I have a suspicion that I'm going to open Pandora's box with this question, Kathryn. What are the shortcomings of current UK government energy policy?
Well, okay, I thought you said this was 45 minutes. So, okay, I think from a motorist perspective, one of the big problems, and this isn't really being discussed very much, is the fuel duty and the energy profits levy, the windfall tax being levied on North Sea oil and gas production. Now, this might seem a little bit niche to most people. Back when the Ukraine war started, oil and gas prices went up quite a lot. And so the newspapers were full of stories of energy companies making large profits. And people got upset because obviously they could see the household electricity and gas bills going up. Now, unfortunately, some of this is to do with the way that energy companies all get lumped in together under the bracket of energy companies. The companies that were making the big profits were people like BP and Shell, who actually don't sell to households. I mean, Shell had a really small supply business, but it was pretty minor. So, and also they make actually most of their money outside of the UK. So when you saw these like BP making massive profits, BP was making massive profits, but it wasn't at the expense of British taxpayers or British motorists. No. The companies, the biggest companies active in the North Sea are people like Harbour Energy. If you saw a headline that said Harbour Energy makes massive profits, then most people would go like, okay, fine, like who cares? They're not a household name, and they're not, them making big profits doesn't upset people. So in response to that whole upset, the government introduced a windfall tax on North Sea oil and gas. And that tax has not reduced in response to the reduction in oil and gas prices. Gas prices are down 84% since their highs. Now, Harbour Energy has said that on some of its North Sea activity, it's now paying an effective tax rate of something like 110%. Now, obviously, that is just pointless, right? So if you're going to pay more tax than you even make in revenues, you're not going to bother. And so Harbour's just announced several hundred job losses. It's announced that it's going to move its activities away from the North Sea. And this is repeated across the sector. So other independents, Enquest, Serica, Ithaca, all of these people that nobody's ever really heard of unless you're in the industry, they're all sort of pulling in their horns and really thinking about their strategy and whether they shouldn't just move to other countries that have a less penal tax regime. Now, on top of this, you have the government's limited and refusing to grant new licenses, which means that we're not replacing the oil and gas that we're producing with new achievable reserves and resources. Now, people say, oh, the basin's in decline, so this doesn't really matter, blah, blah, blah. But actually, Norway just made a massive discovery not far away from the UK continental shelf. So we know there's more oil and gas out there, and some of it is going to be stuff that we can extract. Now, what people don't realise actually is that
Kathryn, sorry, under the current regime, though, the government isn't going to exploit those reserves, and in fact, we'll end up buying oil from the Norwegians that we could have actually extracted ourselves.
Exactly, and actually, there's a massive tax impact for this that people can't really see. So the windfall tax itself, because it's going to mean that fewer barrels of oil and less gas are produced from the North Sea. Investment bank Stifel has said that they think that the reduction in tax income that will cause will be something like £20 billion across the remaining life of the basin. Now, the other, and you're also seeing job losses in the supply chain. So hundreds of thousands of people work in the supply chain. So not just the companies that are like Harbour and Ithaca and so on that are extracting the oil and gas. You've also got the companies that provide all the equipment, that service the platforms, all of that stuff. There's tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people working in that supply chain. Their jobs are at risk. So obviously the taxes that those companies pay will fall. We've seen the customers of the oil and gas companies, the refineries and chemical factories closing and scaling their business. That also has a tax impact. And finally, the one that really isn't on the radar is that because of the way our tax regime works, producers pay extra tax while the field is producing, but then they get a rebate when they move into decommissioning. That means the government gives them cash. Now, that wasn't expected to happen until the late 2030s or into the 2040s. But because the people are scaling back their activities, that's all coming forward. And now it's expected to be in the early 2030s. And it's going to be something like £2 or £3 billion a year in cash that the Treasury has to fund to pay out to these companies under the tax rules. So not only will the tax receipts fall, but a massive tax liability is looming. And it's just outside the Office for Budget Responsibility's 5-year budget horizon. So nobody's really looking at it yet. But in the middle of the next parliament, this huge tax bill will suddenly show up, and that's going to be every year. So the Treasury is going to have to, not only is it going to lose the 20 billion of direct taxes from the basin, the additional billions from the supply chain, it's also going to have to start funding these tax rebates to producers, and that's coming much sooner than it would have done otherwise. Now, if you look at the economy as a whole, now clearly people are talking about a 50 billion tax black hole that's going to have to be filled in the budget. What does that mean from a motoring perspective? Well, your oil and gas is more expensive than it would have been. Well, gas obviously is not an issue, but the oil is more expensive. You're probably going to start seeing increases in fuel duty. You're going to see increases elsewhere in taxes. Income tax is probably going to go up. VAT might go up. You know, all the taxes that we end up paying as individuals will have to go up to offset the reduction in tax that you would have had from the North Sea. So that whole part of oil and gas policy, where we're doing down our own resources and importing instead, has a massive, massive tax implication that will hit all of us in our pockets.
Yeah, well, and now the economy.
And then, of course, you've got the whole thing around, we have the highest industrial electricity prices in the world, and in the developed world, and the fourth highest domestic electricity prices in the developed world. We've seen wholesale electricity, gas prices, as I said, falling 84%. We've definitely not seen that reflected in the bills that we pay for gas and electricity. And why is it? What's driving those bills? It's the cost of net zero. We're paying billions of pounds a year in subsidies. The subsidy last year for offshore wind, the new subsidy last year for offshore wind was £83 a megawatt hour in today's money. The price to generate electricity from gas last year was only £73 a megawatt hour. Yeah. So it's 13% higher for offshore wind. Onshore wind and solar were just slightly below 70 or just above 70. It was around there. So it's slightly below. But of course, the wholesale price of electricity includes a massive carbon tax. Yeah. So if you strip that away, then the cost of generating electricity using gas is the cheapest way, along with nuclear.
But I mean, the whole thing's crazy because the renewable strategy, if there's too much capacity coming in from renewables, they'll actually pay them to curtail.
Yes, exactly. So the Seagreen wind farm that opened in October 2023, in 2024, 2/3 of its output was curtailed. Of the amount of electricity it could generate, only 1/3 actually was used.
Because they don't know how to.
And they got paid. And now, so those curtailment costs are a couple of £1 billion a year. The system operator NESO thinks that in terms of curtailment volumes, that might increase like 9-fold by 2030. So you can expect a commensurate cost increase. And this is because we have an explicit policy called Connect and Manage that says basically don't worry about whether you can use the electricity, just connect the wind farms. That's the priority. And recently I was speaking to Ofgem and I said, you have so Ofgem's mandate is now very conflicting because they have a consumer duty to protect consumers, but they also have a net zero mandate.
Yeah.
And I said, how does it make sense? How does it protect consumers or promote net zero if you're paying wind farms to turn off and that you're deliberately opening these wind farms behind bottlenecks in the grid, without taking any consideration of the size and extent of that bottleneck or when it might be resolved? Yeah. And these situations are persisting for years. And then so now Ofgem is saying, oh, yeah, actually, that you probably have a point with that. Maybe we should put some limits around Connect and Manage. And I hope that they do take that on board and do that, because and Seagreen's not the only example. It's just the worst one. There's other wind farms where it's just half the time that they're being turned off. So way improvement. But it's outrageous. But the cost of renewables is much more than just that, right? Because the wind is only blowing like 1/3 of the time. And with solar, the capacity factor is 10%. So if you put in a 100 megawatt solar farm, you really, over the course of a year, you get out 10. Yeah. So you don't have to have generation available to operate when it's not windy and sunny. So you're paying primarily gas power stations more money to be available because because of wind and sun, they have a lower utilization level, and so not always can cover all their fixed costs or meet their internal rates of return that they need to make. And normally the choice would be just to close. But of course, you can't afford for them to close because then when it's not windy, you'll be in trouble. So then they have to be paid extra money to make up for the fact that they're not generating when it is windy.
But this is the wrong way around.
You then have to pay a lot more money to connect renewables to the grid because they have really low energy density. If I want to have a gas power station, 700 megawatts, 800 megawatts, then that's just one grid connection. A similar sized wind farm is going to need 60 turbines. But of course, they're only working 1/3 of the time. So you then need sort of 150 to 180 to get the same equivalent energy per year. And obviously, that's a lot of wires.
Yeah, it is.
And then,
absolutely.
of course, every cloud, every gust of wind impacts the real-time output of these renewables. And just because of the nature of the electricity grid, you have to have supply and demand have to actually be closely matched in real time. So you then have to continually manage that. You have to charge and discharge batteries and vary your output on thermal generation to maintain that balance. And that's adding billions of pounds a year to our bills as well.
But the battery capacity is never going to be able to store the amounts of power that we really want to be able to use to effectively manage the grid.
Of course.
In fact, we'd probably be better turning off all the renewables, increasing the capacity from combined cycle gas turbine and nuclear.
Yes, exactly. And all things being equal, that would be the ideal strategy, that we build lots more nuclear and that we build gas in the interim. And all things being equal, in normal conditions, you could expect to build a gas turbine in a year and a half. But there's a massive, massive wrinkle here. 1/3 of our gas power stations were built in the 1990s are coming to end of life. But right now, if you phone up GE or Siemens, the biggest sellers of gas turbines, and say, I want to order a new GT, they're going to say, okay, how's 2033? It's an 8-year lead time for a new gas turbine. It's a 5-year lead time for a new rotor. Even for the components for major maintenance is a year and a half. So how are we going to maintain this the third of the fleet, which everybody says we absolutely need to keep, even if we're just holding it in reserve, we absolutely need to keep. How are we going to do that with end-of-life assets that you can't upgrade and refresh or replace?
So
now, obviously, you're looking at a decade at least for new nuclear. Of our existing nuclear plants, all but one is going to close by 2030. So we're looking down the barrel of a massive capacity hole. Now, I think, ironically, that might cause us to look again to coal, because you can build a coal power station in 3 years. That's the lead time for a new coal turbine. And so we might have really almost no choice when it comes to making sure the lights stay on.
But you can build new coal stations with what is it, superheated, where they basically burn it so hot that you produce very little pollution. I mean, the Chinese are actually using them to produce steam for their nuclear reactors. Supercritical, is it?
Yes, that's right. And they do have a much cleaner burn than legacy coal power stations did. But I think it's going to come down to a potential choice between anything that you can possibly build in time versus having the possibility of rationing and shortages. And, obviously that has a really big negative economic impact, but we saw in the blackout in Iberia back in April, 11 people lost their lives. So, we shouldn't be, taking this for granted. Energy shortages in developed countries are really, really dangerous.
Okay.
We're going to go to a short break, but we'll be back right after this.
Leaving on a jet plane, don't know when I'll be back again. Oh babe, I hate to go, but I'm leaving on a jet plane.
Oh, the first time I heard that was not Sophie, whatever she was called, it was Peter, Paul and Mary. It's like 50 years ago. It's a nice song. Paul, you're gonna. I think we've already hit on some of them, but
we pretty much answered that next question that I was going to ask, which is, are there examples of the shortcomings evident from the events here and abroad? But we've touched on Iberia and Norway, but Heathrow often gets mentioned.
Yeah. So that's the other big black hole that we're facing. There was a huge spike in grid investment in the 1970s. So half of our power lines, a third of our transformers, and 30% of our switchgear were built in the 70s. Now, power lines is not such a big deal because they do last quite a long time, but not so much transformers. And the one that caused the blackout at Heathrow was installed in the 1960s. And weirdly, National Grid thought that it had a low rate end of life rating, which meant they thought it had quite a long way to go before it might fail. And I've had some pretty interesting discussions with Ofgem around this, around how they should be looking at these things, because National Grid and the other regulated utilities, they can't just spend what they want. Well, they can, but not if they expect to get the money back from consumers. So we have what we call a price control, where they submit business plans to Ofgem for all of their investments, spending, and then Ofgem decides whether they can spend that money or not, and then get the cost of it back from consumers through bills.
Right.
And these price controls last for 5 years. So I looked at the second price control period that's just finishing now, and the third one that's about to start, and they're consulting on how much money they'll be allowed to spend. And what you notice is that time and again, Ofgem is saying, oh yes, the investment that you want to make to connect renewables, that's all great. These projects are amazing. Yeah, you can definitely have the money for that. But when National Grid comes along and says, right, we need to spend all this money to upgrade legacy grid, then Ofgem's like, no, you haven't proved the need. You haven't put in any projects that are lower than the benchmark. We're going to, and they're taking a knife and slashing the request for this expenditure. Now, it might be that because everyone knows Ofgem is more interested in connections, and connecting new stuff is a bit more interesting than dealing with old stuff, that simply National Grid doesn't devote the same resources to the legacy infrastructure planning, and therefore isn't putting together such compelling business cases for that. or it might be that Ofgem itself is just very biased against those projects. But either way, and I said to Ofgem, you need to understand that, because this happened in the previous price control as well. And now you've had, and that incident at Heathrow, there were 2 maintenance failures associated with that substation. They knew there was moisture ingress within the transformer that would cause it to fail. And under their own maintenance rules, that transformer should have been taken out of service until that issue had been addressed and rectified. They also had a long-term fault that they'd known about for at least 2 years. So they knew about the moisture ingress for, I think, something like 4 or 5 years. They knew about the fault with the fire suppression system for about 2 years. So how is it they know about these faults and they're not addressing them? And the regular maintenance had been delayed and delayed so often at that substation that, you know, they'd also extended the gap between maintenance periods. They changed their policy on maintenance. So instead of having like 4 years, they moved it to 5 years. But not only had they not done it in 5 years, they now was like at 7 or 8 years. So they were halfway through what should have been the next maintenance period. So there's been a huge neglect, if you like, of legacy infrastructure. And given there was so much investment in the 70s and all this stuff is now 50 years old, some of it really will need replacing. But because bills are so high, Ofgem doesn't want to charge more money for grid investment. So the focus is, well, we need to connect all these new renewables, and then you don't have any money left to spend on the legacy grid. And so what you might find is more transformers catching fire, switchgear failing, and that causing, you know, power cuts and localized blackouts. And obviously, I mean, the Heathrow thing costs tens of millions of pounds, so this isn't trivial.
But I mean, the other thing is that the more and more renewables we try to connect, the more and more copper and all the rest of it, cement and stuff like that, we're going to need to build wind turbines in Orkney, and then copper wire the power back to the mainland. And then the other thing is you need to upgrade all the substations, because if you're going to charge electric cars and things, it means all the consumer units have to be uprated, and the cost must be enormous.
So I wouldn't be able to have an electric car here because I'm right on the end of the network. I'm the last house, and I've got this single phase supply that comes over some fields. So I actually have a backup diesel generator just in case.
Right.
But honestly, I'm just going to drive the cars I have until they fall to bits.
I think most sane people will as well, because I'm not a great fan of battery electric vehicles because I don't like lithium-ion batteries. You know,
they're very dirty to make, and that's what people don't take into account. They're not environmentally sustainable, and I actually hate driving automatics, so I won't be swapping. I was in Montana in the summer, and we rented this car, and obviously in North America they like everything big, and so we had, I don't know if you know the Ford Expedition. And this thing's like a tank; it's enormous. So you pull out to overtake something, and it's an automatic, and you put your foot down. Absolutely nothing happened. And then you've got oncoming traffic and you're like, like nothing's happening. I'm not overtaking this car because there's actually no extra power being delivered. And then all of a sudden the car goes, oh yeah, you're pressing the accelerator a lot. Oh, okay. And there's this huge lurch as it changes gear. And then you get
I think I've seen them on things like
the oncoming traffic is getting closer and closer. Like,
I wouldn't fancy that at all. I like.
No, I didn't enjoy that experience.
No.
I'm quite happy with my manual.
Well, my wife won't drive an automatic. She's got a manual as well. I have intermittent back problems. I used to drive a manual. Basically, I drive an automatic now for convenience, just in case sciatic pain kicks in, but I wouldn't otherwise. Anyway,
so I don't really like. I try and avoid driving anywhere where I'll have to sit in traffic and be on the clutch all the time, because I have disabilities that have a similar impact. But now I live quite rurally, so that's not really a thing. And, you know, when you've got nice 60-mile-an-hour rural roads, then, you know, the manual is really good. You can corner nicely, you can accelerate and overtake people.
I'm with you on that. But of course, the safety crazies in Vision Zero, they'll have everything reduced their horse and cart speeds if they can possibly.
But see, this is the whole hair shirt thing around net zero. That they do, you know, they want us to travel less. They don't want us to fly. Absolutely. They want us to heat our homes less. I mean, NESO puts out this thing called the Future Energy Scenarios every year, which I really stopped paying attention to because I did an investigation when it was 10 years old and discovered that it was actually quite a rubbish forecasting tool. Lots of people use it for forecasting, but I looked at over 10 years at each scenario and what they said on certain metrics. And then I compared it with outturn when you actually got to the outturn, and discovered a massive directional bias within the models, that they were always appearing just on the edge of the scenarios and sometimes outside them.
Yeah.
And I just thought, well, this is a bit useless. So I stopped paying attention to it. But then occasionally someone will draw my attention to some aspect. And one of those was around heating. And they just randomly said, oh, people will heat their homes 1 degree less. So I asked them, I said, okay, can you show me the data that you use to support this? Can you show me household heating data so I know what you think people currently heat their homes to? So they sent me some stuff which I already had found, which was government data that went back to, it was like 2011 or 2013 or something. And okay, I mean, this is more than a decade old. Where's the more recent data? And then we haven't got any. And well, then how do you know people will be, if you don't know what the temperature is that they're heating to now, how do you know they'll reduce by 1 degree? And well, we just think that's what they'll do. Well, but why do you think that? Well, I mean, in the gas crisis when everything was expensive, we think they did that. So we think they'll do it again for net zero. I'm like, but what evidence do you have?
Oh, clearly evidence doesn't matter.
No. But then the following year, they changed it to 0.5 degrees. But again, no explanation, no rationale, no evidence base for this. They're just pulling numbers out of the air.
Yeah.
And there's an organisation called UK Fires that thinks we're going to cut our heating by 60%.
Oh, you found it as well, UK Fires. That's what I was expecting that document when I read it.
No, I mean, it's insane, right? I mean, who says? And if you actually look into this, which I did a couple of years ago, and so I did this whole thing about energy performance certificates, because they're complete junk, right? They're made up. I did this house behind me is quite old, and we did a big renovation when we bought it, completely rewired everything, new heating, the works, new windows, new roof. So this house is nice and cozy. The old part is solid 9-inch thick walls. We've got a thatch. The thatch is sort of asymmetric. So at the back, it comes down to within a meter of the ground level. So it's like wrapping the house in a duvet. And our EPC went from a D to an F, despite all the improvements I've made, because we don't have foundations. So, and I think running pipework along the walls is a bit ugly. So I took out the radiators downstairs and put in electric heating, underfloor heating. Now I don't use it because the house is nice and warm. But because I'd swapped from gas heating, which is cheap, to electric heating, which isn't, my EPC went from D to F. Now, I could fix that straight away because I still have a boiler. I could just put radiators in. It would cost me a couple of £1,000, job done. But they can't recommend that. So the recommendations are on my EPC would have a cost of something like between £30,000 and £50,000. And I might finally repay that cost in about 50 years if I'm lucky. And it's all things like, it's a wind turbine. I can't put a wind turbine. I live in a conservation area and I've got a thatched roof, so I can't put it on the roof. But the plot's too small to put it in the garden because there's distance to boundary regulations for hosts. So it's weird that one part of the government's telling you to do something that another part of the government would tell you not to do. And if I just accepted the recommendations on my EPC and did them, then I'd get in trouble from the council because they'd be like, well, no, you're breaching planning regulations. You can't do that. And I'll be like, yeah, but the government said, on my EPC. And they're like, no, but you can't. Like install outside cladding on your house. Well, you need planning permission for that. You can't just do it.
Justification of jobs. There you go.
So, I mean, it's absolutely crazy. So this whole piece, and actually, while I was doing that case study about my own EPC and how the EPC works more broadly, I did a bit of research into building use in the domestic space and how that had linked with heating. And so I found some really interesting stuff going back to the 1930s, where you'd have all these local authorities. And obviously in those days, it was all men. And you find these like documents of minutes from council meetings and so on. And they're saying, well, housewives don't want this and that happening in their scullery and all the rest of it. And I'm like, well, how do you know? But of course, back in those days, the men would go out to work. The women would stay in the home, but they'd typically be in the kitchen or the scullery where they'd have a fire or a range. And the rest of the house wouldn't be heated. And even though you had little fireplaces in the bedrooms, they were typically only used for elderly people or if people were ill. And so, and then children were not in the house during the day. They were either at school or working or playing. And over time, you've seen a change of use of the home. So now we use more living areas. We don't actually spend that much time in the kitchen. We cook and then we go and eat somewhere else normally. And bedrooms are used a lot more. People don't just use bedrooms for sleeping. Children will use it for homework, for example. Teenagers will just hang out in their bedrooms because they don't want to hang out with their parents downstairs. And of course, they don't want to do that in the cold. And then you have this whole trend of people sleeping naked. And so they want to have their bedrooms heated. So if they get like they're not chilly. And so, historically, you didn't heat bedrooms. Now heating bedrooms, even round the clock, is a lot more common. And so the energy consumption from heating is increasing simply as a result of us changing the way that we use the buildings that we live in.
Yeah. And the government really isn't picking up on this, I suspect, not properly.
Well, no, I mean, they just say, they think insulation and behaviour changes. So I think there should be some behaviour changes, because I think we did get used to a period, particularly where gas prices for heating were quite low, of wearing fewer clothes at home and putting the heating on instead. So, how many people do you know that will walk around in shorts and t-shirt year round and bare feet and just turn the heating up rather than putting on a jumper? I have that argument sometimes with my husband. He'll be like, oh, it's freezing in here. Also, we have 2 cats, one of whom is extremely stupid and won't use the cat. So we keep a window open for her. And so then I'm not going to heat the room just so the cat can go in and out of the window and have the window open. I put on a jumper. We have blankets on the sofa because it's actually quite cozy to do that anyway. We've got a wood burning stove. And that's fine. And then my husband comes and I'm like, we'll put some socks on and a jumper and stop moaning, right? Because I'm not putting the heating on just that.
Right. Trying to get us back onto our agenda. We briefly touched on the sort of problems, the grid problems that have occurred around the world. Do you want to go into any of those in more detail? We've talked about Heathrow. Do you want to mention the Iberian thing and the other thing which has come up recently about Norway? And I mean, most people, certainly not in the automotive sector that we're really, don't seem to realise that we are now really very, very heavily dependent on energy that we're importing from outside through interconnect and things like that.
Yeah. So the Norway thing is very interesting. We now import a lot of our electricity. And actually, we've come to a point where we're pretty reliant on imports. And one of the countries that we're very reliant on is Norway. The other one's France, actually. So we have interconnectors with Norway, France, Netherlands, Belgium, Denmark, and Denmark. We also have a lot with Ireland, but we always export to Ireland. So I kind of treat that as just another source of demand on the GB grid. And actually, if we came to demand control, which is when they ration it because there's not enough demand, there's an agreement with Ireland. And so Ireland, it's the whole island of Ireland has a unified electricity grid. The agreement is that they would get reductions in the exports to them in line with curtailment demand control in Britain. So it's literally treated as an extension of Britain for the purposes of electricity. And I don't mean to make any political thing out of that. That's just simply how the electricity market works. So France and Norway have very different energy mixes to everyone else. France is heavily nuclear and Norway is heavily hydro. It's about 90% hydro and about 9% wind, and then a few other random bits and pieces. And all of the international interconnectors in Norway connect in the south of Norway. Norway's divided into 5 pricing zones, and this one is called NO2. And they don't have very good connection between the different zones. So the north of Norway actually has abundant, their reservoirs are overflowing, they've got heaps of water. But in the south, they're approaching 20-year lows on their reservoirs. And this is becoming a real issue politically, because since they opened interconnectors to Britain and Germany in 2021, they've had huge price volatility in Norway. They've seen Germany close its nuclear reactors and us closing our coal power stations and essentially replacing that with imports from Norway. And that's caused a lot of price volatility in Norway because now their market prices respond to whether it's windy in Britain and Germany and not. So they used to have very low stable prices and now they jump all over the place. But they've also increased a lot in outright terms. So the Norwegian government is now subsidizing end users, sort of households in Norway, to up to 90% of their electricity bills. And so if you were to step out into London and grab someone off the street and say, what do you think about electricity interconnectors? They'd be like, leave me alone, you weirdo. If you went to Norway and asked them that question, they would give you like a detailed answer about how terrible they are and how they're causing price increases in Norway, and this, something needs to be done.
Yeah.
So it's a really big issue. Now they've got parliamentary elections in Norway on Monday, and quite a few of the parties there now, well, all of them pretty much, except for the Conservatives, are against interconnection. And Labour, which is the governing party right now, has taken the position that it's not going to approve any more interconnectors, but it won't ban or get rid of the existing ones, except for ones that are expiring through age. So 2 of the cables with Denmark are coming to the end of their lives in the next couple of years, and it's now pretty much agreed they won't be replaced. So that's going to cut cross-border capacity with Denmark by about, or just under a third, which is massive, right? Norway reduces its energy exports to Denmark. That's a really big deal.
Yeah.
So, but several of the other parties, they don't just want to stop new ones. They want to cancel the old ones.
Yeah.
They want to renegotiate the deals with Britain and Germany in particular to reduce the use or even remove them. And with its sovereign wealth fund, they could just buy it out. They could just say like, so this is like the one with Britain is owned by National Grid Ventures, which is a subsidiary of National Grid PLC. They could just say, right, here's compensation for you not being able to use this interconnector anymore. Go away. End of. And so National Grid would get compensated, but that would reduce the available electricity in Britain by 1.4 gigawatts, which is about equivalent to 2 good-sized gas power stations. Now, because they're approaching 20-year lows in Norway, 2 things can happen. One is they might just restrict exports. They have the legal powers to do that. And the other one is once they get to shortage territory, their prices will go up so high that we'll actually export to them. And so that means that instead of just losing 2 gas power stations because we just lose the imports, we're exporting. So that impact is then 4 gas power stations. And we don't have that to spare. The other problem is France. They have really neglected to refresh their nuclear fleet. Twice in 6 years, they had to take large numbers of their reactors out of service because of systemic problems. The French regulator has said with an aging fleet, we can expect that to happen again. The 2 times it did happen, it lasted about a year and they were importing instead of exporting. So, and we have a bigger capacity with France. It's something like 3 or 4 gigawatts. So, you're talking, if we were exporting, then you're talking much more like 8 to 10 power stations. And because instead of importing, we're exporting. And so we just don't have that to spare. And then, of course, if our power stations start closing, you quite quickly see why we get in a hole.
Yeah, well, absolutely. And if all this happens as the Dunkel flags are up in, right across Northern Europe, then we're up a gum tree very much.
Yeah, and we've had wind output this year's down 6% in Britain, despite we having more wind turbines. Imports are down 10% because wind is down in Europe as well. And hydro levels have been down across Europe, not just in Norway. And so as a result, we've had to increase our use of gas power stations by 17%.
Yeah. So all of this is adding to, the figures don't add up because the government's trying to drive us down a path where we become more and more reliable on reliably unreliable renewables.
Yes, exactly. So, and they're lying to us about saying they're cheap and they're not.
Yeah. So they claim that these are cheaper than gas and nuclear generation.
Even the subsidy isn't cheaper than generating with gas.
No.
So if the first order cost of renewables, the subsidy, is higher than the cost of generating electricity with gas, then once you take the full system cost into account while you're paying for the backup and managing the intermittency and the extra connections and the curtailments, then no way. I mean, it's way more expensive. That's why our bills are going up. Yeah. I published a report in May where I looked at the cost of net zero, and I found that if you look since 2006, we've spent just under £220 billion in today's money on net zero and achieved no reduction in bills whatsoever. That's just money out of the door. Yeah. And the Climate Change Committee has said that it doesn't expect us to see any net zero savings until the 7th budget period, which is 2038 to 2042. And its assumptions on wind costs are crazy optimistic. I mean, they think that in 2030 they're going to be half what they are today, but costs are increasing, not decreasing. So that is just never going to happen. But when Miliband says we're going to have £300 reduction in bills by 2030, even the Committee on Climate Change disagrees with that. And this is something that hasn't really been reported. Climate Change Committee said not until 2038. Miliband is like, oh, £300 in 2030. No, that's just some number he pulled out of the air. Well, it came from a piece of research by a consulting firm called Ember, that they were using an old price cap, and there'd already been a £300 reduction by the time they published that report because of the falling gas prices.
Right. So it's just it's a house of cards built on a tissue of lies. It's just dreadful.
Basically.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. Now this is probably another even worse Pandora's box question. How can we future-proof or even present-day proof our energy generation capacity to avoid or to at least head off all these problems? I mean,
well, this is really difficult.
Energy minister tomorrow.
So we immediately need to stop new subsidies. I mean, Miliband now wants the subsidies to go to 20 years. This is insane. We started subsidizing wind in 1990. It's already been 35 years and they want more.
Yeah.
Like, how crazy is that? They've had 35 years of subsidies and they want more. They want another 20 years at least.
Well, but basically that says the technology is never going to be viable without.
Exactly. Yeah. So originally it was all like, oh, it's an immature technology. It needs to be subsidized to get it going. And, I can have some sympathy with that. But after 35 years, I think you really have to admit that it's not going to happen. Right. Yeah. This is never going to stand on its own feet. And actually, that should be kind of obvious when you think about it, because so the way electricity pricing works is that you're supposed to charge something that's essentially your short-term marginal cost of production. Now, at the moment, because of marginal pricing, that's based on the last gas power station that you need to meet demand. But if we got rid of all the gas power stations and just use wind and solar, then the wholesale price of electricity would fall down to around zero. Good. And everyone goes, yeah, well, the wind is free, so what's your problem? Well, the machines that you need to turn the wind into electricity, they're not free. They're really expensive. They cost billions of pounds. How are you going to pay for those billion pound machines if you're having to sell your product for zero? You're basically giving it away. How will you your machines?
Machinery that's being built overseas using coal-powered power stations.
But you still wouldn't be able to pay for it. If you're giving your product away, it doesn't matter what your product is. If you give it away, you're never going to cover your costs.
No.
Just because you don't have a fuel cost doesn't mean you don't have other costs.
No.
Yeah.
And so the logic, right, if you think this through, just as a thought experiment, it doesn't work. Yeah. And yet our whole energy policy is based on this.
So we established that the renewables, they're not cheaper than gas and nuclear generation.
No.
So with that being false, why are they being allowed to get away with distorting the facts and making these claims?
Well, that's a really good question. And that's all to do with a combination of ideology and special interests. So, for example, Dale Vince has been in the media recently. He owns Ecotricity, which has renewable generation. He's made a very large amount of money from subsidies. And yet he says, no, they're not subsidies. You can't call them subsidies because they don't get paid by the state. So therefore, they're not a subsidy. Like, they're being paid from bills by consumers, and consumers have zero choice about paying them. Does it make a difference to the consumer whether you call it a subsidy or not? So he's trying to claim he's not earning a subsidy.
Yeah.
But it doesn't matter.
You're
getting there's an economic transfer from consumers to companies like his.
Yeah. Yes.
What do we get in return for that?
Yeah.
More
and of course,
electricity.
Well, yeah, and the UK has the highest energy prices in the developed world. Yet there are no prosperous, high growth, high energy cost economies in the developed world. How does this stack up with government's alleged pursuit of economic growth at all costs?
It doesn't.
No.
It doesn't. So, I mean, Donald Trump's been very clear on this. Economic growth is required by cheap energy. And like, this is very orthodox. Like, this is not something that anybody really disagrees with. The disagreement comes over whether you get cheap energy from renewables. And the answer is you don't.
Yeah.
You can't possibly. Well, okay. So renewables like hydro and geothermal, they can be cheap, but not weather-based renewables. No, because the weather's not reliable enough.
And
the
of
low
course,
energy density kills you as well. So you need a lot more infrastructure because it's low energy density.
Yeah.
Nuclear has something like 2,000 times more energy density than wind. So if you the amount of land that you would need for nuclear is about 2,000 times less than the amount of land you'd need for an equivalent amount of wind.
Yeah.
And of course, solar, you've got problems because you need all of this area for solar cells. You're taking away prime agricultural land sometimes to put them there. And once the cells actually degrade, which they do eventually, then you've got to remove all that stuff. There's a huge disposal problem because they're not easy. I don't think you can recycle them at all. And the other thing is, and I can't remember the name of the study, but I saw it earlier in the year, basically said that if you wanted to choose the worst place in the world to set up a solar installation, you would put it in the UK or Northern Ireland. Because
so that's the World Bank, and they found that the UK is the second worst place in the world for solar, and Ireland is the worst place.
Right, okay. So
and the other issue, of course, is that most of this stuff is coming from China, where it's being made using forced labor.
Exactly. Yeah.
And it's got software built into it. The Chinese can turn it off at will, allegedly.
Well, apparently, yes.
So if you wanted to make a sort of crazy Clockwork Orange energy scenario, it's probably it.
Yeah.
Good grief.
No, exactly. And I think Germany is up there with us in terms of just the stupidest energy policies. We've designed our energy system to be both unreliable and expensive. It's the exact opposite of what you want. And then they're gaslighting people into, oh no, it's cheap. No, it's not. We can see from our bills it's not cheap.
Yeah. And as a result, manufacturing industry is in flight from this country and from Germany. German car industry's on its uppers now. Ours is just about disappeared.
Well, that brought down the Scholz government. It was quite interesting. Germans have been quite relaxed about high energy costs right up until the point where Volkswagen said it was going to close its German factories. So they didn't even care when BASF closed its factories. But when VW said, we're going to close our German factories, the German public went, that's too much for us. That's a step too far. And that really brought down the government. Yeah.
Well, that thing, the bit, BASF is a huge chemicals company. And there's so much we rely on, people don't realize, fossil fuel derived, antibiotics, all of the medical equipment.
This drives me so crazy when people say, we're just going to stop oil. And I'd be like, well, okay, first of all, get off social media because that wouldn't exist without oil. Secondly, you better make sure you really look after your health because apart from the people, you try finding something in a hospital that's not made out of oil. Yeah. If you go for chemotherapy, you walk on a floor made out of oil, past walls made out of oil or covered in oil, through doors made out of oil, past windows made out of oil. You go sit on a chair made out of oil when a tube made out of oil connects you to a machine made out of oil that delivers drugs made out of oil into your body. Chemotherapy drugs and almost all other drugs used in modern healthcare are made out of oil. So, you just tell me whether we should just stop oil. Yeah,
absolutely. With you 100% on that because of my own background in chemicals. It's crazy. And of course, the other thing is we look over the sort of past 100 years or so, average lifespan's pretty much doubled. Because of the availability of oil, of cheap energy derived from oil.
And it's interesting because a couple of years ago, Sri Lanka decided it was going to ban synthetic fertilizer, which is made out of natural gas. And within months, they had destroyed their economy, required an IMF bailout, and then reversed the ban. It was one of the fastest economic collapses in history. They went from being a net exporter of rice to not being able to feed their own people and had food riots as a result. So, like this is insane. People just do not understand the extent to which hydrocarbons support modern life. And without them, we would be literally stuck back in a pre-industrialized world with subsistence farming and no modern healthcare and no modern technology, because this could not happen without oil.
Exactly.
And it's not the energy component necessarily, it's the plastics.
And they're everywhere.
I can't wait. I can't wait to hear your thoughts on this, Kathryn. Brian, do you want to ask the last question?
Yeah, go on. All right then. Listen, I'm afraid we've opened Pandora's box so many times today.
I'm like dreading to think what this question is.
If somebody made you minister in charge of UK energy security, what changes would you make now?
Oh, the I ruled the world question. Okay. Right. So
You'd rather you than Ed Miliband, that's for sure.
I'd obviously stop new subsidies. I would use statutory instruments to change some of the legacy ones. There are some pretty easy wins there. The legacy renewables obligation that doesn't finish until 2037, I think, that's indexed to RPI, not CPI. You could change that. It would reduce costs by billions of pounds. Some of the projects were getting more than one ROC, so certificate per megawatt hour. I would reduce them all to one, so they're all the same. And I actually think the legal basis for that would be pretty straightforward. Beyond that, changes are more difficult, but most of the larger companies anyway, holding a lot of these subsidies, expect to continue doing business in the UK for many years to come. So there are deals to be done there. I mean, you can say, well, you've got to take a haircut, and if you refuse, then you're just going to be excluded from future business. So you can choose, like, hold on to your subsidies and never do new projects for several decades, or negotiate and we'll keep you in play for future stuff. So I'd do that. Then I'd have to think really hard about what I was going to do about the capacity shortage, because here we are constrained with supply chains. So I'd certainly place orders probably for the Korean APR 1400 nuclear reactors. They've got a great track record building those in 8.5 years at an average cost of $4 to $5 billion US. I'd legislate to cut through most of the regulatory barriers. They have a deal with Westinghouse that they won't sell this reactor in Britain, but I think there's deals to be done there. Westinghouse also doesn't want to be excluded from the British market. But then I'd have a hard choice around coal and gas, because obviously I'd naturally prefer to build more gas power stations. That's pretty difficult to do if you're going to have to wait 8 years for a new turbine. And if it's not possible to help the turbine manufacturers boost their capacity to bring those dates forward, then there might not be much option other than to pivot to coal. And so I'd be talking with Uniper about maybe building a new coal power station at Ratcliffe, which closed last year. I'd want to talk to Drax about converting back to coal, because that would be a lot cleaner than what they're doing now with wood pellet biomass. And I'd be looking at all of the coal sites that closed to see if it would be viable to reopen them. I mean, they'd need new equipment because they were pretty old, but if they've still got their grid connections and they obviously have the space for all the coal handling and so on, then that would be an obvious choice. So I think there needs to be pragmatism around energy security. I think that has to be the big priority. Of course, I would get rid of the energy profits levy. I would create tax incentives around the North Sea. So I'd be giving people full investment tax relief on new exploration and appraisal activity. I would be scaling back the regulation in the North Sea. I'd get rid of the emissions mandate and the electrification mandate. And I would create a slightly different regulatory environment with very strict penalties for real harm, but then reducing the amount of red tape that happens before stuff gets permitted. And things like tiebacks would be just treated as extensions of the original project, rather than having to go through a whole new set of regulatory hurdles and hoops. And generally across the board, I'd be looking at deregulation, going back to principles-based regulation. I'd bring the Financial Conduct Authority principles into the energy market to allow a simplification of the rules around energy retail. I'd get rid of a lot of the stuff that has nothing to do with energy, excuse me, out of bills. Things like the warm homes discount is actually a benefit. One group of consumers pays more, so another group of consumers can pay less. That's something that should be dealt with by the DWP and the Treasury. That shouldn't be dealt with through bills. And I'm not saying that some people don't need assistance for their bills, but I'd change the way it was delivered. I'd get rid of the energy company obligation. I'd get rid of all of the green levies from bills and put them into taxation. So that would really reduce energy costs. I'd abolish the climate change levy. I would get rid of the ETS now. This is the common trading scheme. Now that's going to create some issues with the EU, but I'm not sure that I particularly care. I think that cheap energy is more important, and just because the EU is self-harming doesn't mean that we need to as well. Brexit does give us a lot more flexibility, and we should exploit that to the max.
Now, Kathryn, I thought you might give us a thorough answer, but you've skirted around. No, only joking.
Yeah, I apologise for sitting on the fence.
Brilliant. Well, I'm afraid we've run out of time. I think, Brian, we need Kathryn on again at some point too.
Absolutely, yeah. We must invite you back, because that was excellent. I mean, but it's just such a subject with so many ramifications. The cost of energy. Charlotte, can you put that chart in the
is on the x-axis you've got penetration of wind and solar, on the y-axis you've got energy cost. So the top right is high energy cost and lots of wind and solar, and the bottom left is low energy costs and not very much wind and solar. You can do alternatives where you're comparing with economic activity, and then obviously you get an inversion on the y-axis. But I mean, the point is wind and solar lead to expensive energy, and then that has an economic detriment. And we in Britain are making that worse because we impose all sorts of additional taxes around energy, which have a huge drag on growth and on economic output. And of course, I was mentioning the accelerated depreciation on the decommissioning in the North Sea. That will create actual funding requirements for the government to find money to pay out to these companies at a far earlier stage than it would have done otherwise. And in the context where the country's running out of money, we should be looking to monetize all of the assets that we can. North Sea oil and gas is a resource that we could exploit. We can turn that resource into cash. And yet, for some reason, Miliband doesn't want to do that. And with a £50 billion budget black hole, I can't imagine why you would want to leave that money in the ground.
No.
Well, I think it's an ideology. It's not common sense. But
no, it's not. And actually, that's why we need, and that's why I do things like this. It's to try and reach out to ordinary people to say, right, these are the things that are happening. This is what all of this stuff means. If you don't think that's good, then take what I say, what other people say, and then go and make your views known. Like complain to your MP, do whatever it is, write stuff on social media, or however you want to express that. It's not okay what's happening. And this budget that's going to be coming up in the autumn, where they try and fill this black hole, is just going to be a total car crash. Sorry to use that expression. Or maybe you don't like that one. But it's going to be brutal.
I always remember the Churchill quote. He said, trying to tax your way to profitability or to economic growth is like standing in a bucket and trying to pick yourself up by the handles.
Yes, exactly. And this Labour government seems to not understand that. They say, like, nobody in the front bench has any experience in running a business, and they see business as this other that is just a source of tax, and they see rich people as a source of tax. And well, guess what? Rich people are super mobile. They'll just go somewhere else, and businesses do the same. We're seeing that in the North Sea. We're seeing like companies like Harbour Energy is the biggest producer in the North Sea. It's a UK company listed in the UK, and it's starting to move its activities away from Britain to other parts of the world where the tax regime is more favourable, and that's causing jobs to be lost here. And so you lose the direct jobs, you lose the indirect jobs in the supply chain. The customer side with the refineries and the chemical plants are closing. So there's a huge adverse tax impact from that. And that's contributing to this £50 billion black hole that they need to fill. And at the same time, the bond markets are expressing discomfort. Our cost of borrowing's increased significantly. So what's Labour going to do? It's almost certainly going to have to break its manifesto promises around taxation. It's showing no willingness to cut spending, and it's looking harder and harder to avoid that IMF bailout that people are talking about. And of course, that will come with compulsory spending cuts and compulsory tax increases. And so that will make it less in our control to recover the situation. The IMF will only care about getting its money back. It won't care about wider economic growth or hardship to the British people. And so we need much smarter energy and economic policies to prevent that from happening.
Well, it's not like Labour to go back on the promise, is it? So, Brian, Kathryn, I think we're going to have to say that that's it for today. But would you be up for coming on again another time, Kathryn?
Definitely, yeah.
Brilliant.
It's been really useful, really interesting. Thanks very much for coming on.
Yeah, thank you
ever
so much.
to come back in the future. Thank you, Kathryn.
It's my pleasure.
Thank you.